Reinforcements have arrived.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Waiting.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Ready and waiting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting. Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged.
Waiting.
New
Affirmative.
construction options. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Very well. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Yes, sir. At once. Very well. Affirmative.
A-bomb launch.
Very
detected.
well. Affirmative. At once. Agreed. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Construction options. Building. On hold. Cancel.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Insufficient
Acknowledged.
funds.
Yes,
Our
sir.
base is under attack.
Waiting orders.
Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. At once. Affirmative. Vehicle affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Reporting. Very well. Very well. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Acknowledged. Report very well. At once.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building. Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Insufficient
Acknowledge.
funds.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Southbound. Alerted.
Unit ready.
Night A.
Construction complete. Construction options.
Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Our base is
Affirmative.
under attack.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building.
Waiting order. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Construction
Acknowledge.
complete.
Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes,
repaired.
sir.
Unit lost.
Report affirmative. Awaiting.
Acknowledge.
Awaiting. Acknowledge.
New construction options. Repairing. Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Vehicle reporting.
Insufficient funds.
Yes, sir.
Vehicle affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Report affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Repairing. Building.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Yes, sir.
repaired.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Affirmative.
Construction
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge.
Construction options.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Building. Insufficient funds. Construction complete. Building. Construction complete.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Our base is under attack.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building.
Report affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Vehicle
lost.
Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction
Acknowledge.
complete.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Vehicle
A bomb launch
affirmative.
detected.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Comrade.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Construction
Acknowledged.
complete.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting order.
New construction options.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Reporting.
Preparing. Unit prepared.
Reporting.
Preparing. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit prepared.
Acknowledged.
Preparing. Construction complete. Our base
Yes,
is
sir.
under attack.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit prepared.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Vehicle acknowledged.
Report. Acknowledged.
Vehicle affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Preparing.
Report. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting.
Unit prepared.
Awaiting acknowledged.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Building. Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Repairing.
Waiting
Building.
order.
A-bomb launch detected.
Awaiting orders.
Unit
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Repairing. Unit ready. Unit prepared.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Building.
Comrade, acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Repairing.
Waiting order.
Reporting.
Unit prepared.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Waiting order.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost. Our base is under attack.
Reporting.
Low power.
Ready and affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Awaiting acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Waiting.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Repairing. Unit repaired. Unit ready. Building. On hold.
Waiting
Prepare.
order. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Ready and affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Building. On hold. Cancel. Building. Unit ready.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Construction options. Building. Construction complete. Building. Construction complete. Building. On hold. Cancel. A-bomb launch detected. Construction complete. Building. Unit ready.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders.
Affirmative, affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative, affirmative. Acknowledge, acknowledge. Affirmative, affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledge. Affirmative, affirmative, affirmative. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting.
Prepare.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative, affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative, affirmative.
Unit prepared.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Spy plane
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative, affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative, affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative, affirmative.
ready. Unit ready.
Affirmative, affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative, affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative, affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative, affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Building.
Waiting order. Affirmative.
Select target.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Comrade. Waiting order.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Yes, sir.
ready.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Our
Affirmative.
base is under attack.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative, affirmative.
Unit ready.
Reporting.
Building.
Acknowledged.
Spy plane ready. Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Waiting affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Waiting acknowledged. Yes, affirmative. Yes, affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Report. Acknowledged.
Repairing. Unit ready. Building. Construction complete. Building. Unit
Yes, sir.
repaired.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete. Repairing. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Awaiting orders.
Affirmative.
Unit repaired. Repairing. target. Unit ready. Preparing. A-bomb launch detected. Building. Unit prepared. Preparing. Unit prepared. Unit ready. Building.
Waiting
Unit
acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Our
Affirmative.
base is under attack.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. Repair.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Reporting.
Spy plane ready. Repair.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit prepared. Select target. Repairing.
Reporting.
Unit ready. Unit prepared.
Awaiting affirmative.
Building. On hold. Cancel.
Comrade. Reporting.
Building.
Reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
sir.
ready.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Spy plane ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Our base is under attack.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Waiting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Waiting. Affirmative. Comrade.
Affirmative.
Insufficient
Yes, sir.
funds.
Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Very well. Very well. Very well.
Building.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
A-bomb.
Affirmative.
Detected.
Affirmative.
Very well.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Comrade.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost. Building.
Yes, sir.
Vehicle report.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Our base is
Affirmative.
under attack. Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledge. 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 Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Report.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Very well.
lost.
Affirmative. 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 Agreed. At once. Agreed. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Agreed. Very well. At once. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed. Yes, sir. Agreed. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Agreed. At once.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Very well.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well. Very well.
Building.
Agreed. Agreed. At once. Affirmative. Very well. At
Unit
once.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Core at once. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. At once. Very well. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. At once.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Objective
At once.
met.
Very well. At once. At once.
Building. Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
No problem.
Affirmative.
Building.
Awaiting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost. Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Report. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Awaiting orders.
Select target. Preparing. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit prepared.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building. Building.
Vehicle reporting.
Reporting.
Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Comrade.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Preparing.
Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit prepared.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Preparing. Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Building.
Waiting order.
Preparing. Unit prepared.
Acknowledge.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Spy plane ready.
Comrade.
Preparing.
Acknowledge.
Select target. Unit
Waiting
prepared.
order. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit prepared.
Affirmative.
Preparing.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Preparing.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit prepared.
Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge.
Prepared.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Unit
Yes,
prepared.
sir.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Prepared.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
prepared.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Preparing.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged.
Unit prepared.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Preparing. Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building. Unit prepared.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Spy plane ready.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Select target.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Comrade. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Reporting.
Acknowledged. Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Building. Repairing.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Waiting order.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit repaired. Repairing.
Comrade. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Waiting order.
Unit
Acknowledged.
repaired.
Vehicle reported. Affirmative.
Spy plane ready.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
On hold.
Acknowledge.
Cancel.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge.
lost.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Reporting. Yes, sir.
lost.
Affirmative. Of course. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Very well. At once. Of course. Very well. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. 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 Agreed. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative. Agreed. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. At once. Of course. Very well. Very well. At once. Yes, sir. Very well. Of course. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Agreed. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Very well. At once. Yes, sir. Agreed.
Mission accomplished.